What is the most shocking thing you've ever seen? 1. Used to be a traffic safety engineer. Traffic collision analysis was part of the job. Images of the collisions are intense and you can never unsee the decapitations. 2. About 6 years ago, my family was traveling to Pennsylvania to visit some relatives for Easter and we drove back on Easter Sunday afternoon. We were driving on I-81 south in Virginia and noticed traffic was slowing down and smoke coming from the side of the road. A car had crossed over the median and hit another car head-on. Both cars were beyond totaled and were engulfed in flames. I remember looking over at one of the cars and seeing a person in the passenger seat, and a good chunk of their head was missing, and the driver appeared to be dead too. I looked it up on the news the next day, and only one person survived out of the 5 people involved in that crash. It was a pretty ugly scene, to put it mildly. 3. Working at a special care home. Had a resident who routinely screamed for help over minor things. Help. I need to turn my lights off kind of thing. One night she fell alone in her room and split her face open above her eye. Instead of calling for help, she just quietly walked out into the common area at 3 a.m. looking like Carrie. It was my first time applying my first aid knowledge and my first time calling 911. Most unforgettable was the sight of her blood-covered rosary. Woman really looked like a movie crew had made her up. 4. There was a case in the UK recently where a couple abused their son to the point where he died. During the court case, they showed video that was taken in the home. I believe the video was taken the day before he was killed. The boy was really young, extremely malnourished, and in a room by himself crying, just talking to himself about how nobody loves him. I'm a 37-year-old man and a new dad. I basically spent the rest of the day crying. It devastated me to think about this kid thinking no one loves him, being abused, not knowing he was going to be dead the next day. Even now, the memory of the video comes back every now and then, and just ruins me. There is no punishment appropriate enough for people who do that to children. 5. I walked in on my sister as soon as she pulled the trigger of a gun to kill herself. I was only 6 at the time and didn't know what she did. But she stopped moving and wouldn't respond to me. When Mom came, I could tell she tried her hardest not to cry in front of me. She just told me to go in my room and play my Wii. An hour or so later she came and told me about what suicide and all that other stuff was, and that's when I realized I'm never gonna see my sister again. 6. Seeing a loved one suspended from a ceiling beam by a rope around their neck. Lifeless. 7. I was walking down a neighborhood where number of homeless people was insane, but most of the time I just mind my own business walking to where I work, but one day, I saw a person eating his own human waste. I was mind-boggled. Later, when I was heading back to my home, I saw him at the same area, so I decided to give some leftovers I got from the shop I was working. Man, he was the happiest person he saw when I gave him the food. 8. Went to visit my grandfather, and found him lying in his front doorway covered in blood, and barely conscious. I had dealt with emergency situations before, but this made me freeze up. Managed to tell my wife not to get our son out of the car and to get his neighbor, a nurse, then called an ambulance and tried my best to make him comfortable. Doctor at the hospital said a heart issue made him collapse, and there was no saving him once that had happened, but he laid alone through the night, and halfway through the next day conscious but unable to move. It's been 3 years and I still feel guilty for not visiting sooner and wonder if I had done things differently, would he still be here? I still think about going to visit him or calling him before remembering he's gone, and every time I think about him, that is what I see. 9. Pedestrian hit by a car. The victim looked like a fake body as he flew through the air. He had a shoe land over half a block away. Somehow only broke a leg. 10. A kid bawling his eyes out, begging with a sign and no coat in 20-degree weather in a downtown setting. It was really windy out, and I saw him talking briefly to his mom in a doorway, who was bundled up out of the cold, texting the whole time. She was dressed expensively, looked comfortable, and didn't seem to want to be seen with him. Talked to building security who brought the boy inside. Was on my way to work, so I didn't get to see the full resolution. Shitty mom. 11. I was a middle school teacher. 7th grade. I told a parent I thought her child had a learning disability, dyslexia, during parent-teacher conferences, and recommended testing. The school would facilitate it, and her kid would be set up before high school. Her response was to smack her kid so hard, the dean ran in thinking a kid had put hands on an adult. The worst thing, the kid just sat there. He was so used to it. It became a big thing above my head immediately, and I was instructed to never bring it up to the student. But I felt so guilty. That kid needed help and support, not abuse. You can't smack away a learning disability, but you can create lifelong trauma. 12. Trigger warning. Potential child abuse. Say. I've been debating posting this comment, but it's something I saw when I was a kid that still haunts me to this day, and I'm not 100% sure of what I saw, but given what this person did to me, you could safely bet that I saw this. Because I was an OZ obnoxious kid and at the time a little brother, I've since disowned this piece of shit. I would often get onto my older brother's computer and snoop through his files to see what I could find, often just looking for games to play. This was back in the mid to late 90s. I eventually found his porn folder. He was into some weird stuff at the time. Women using bowling pins as dildos, golden showers, incredibly obese women. And I found the really weird stuff. He was photoshopping the daughter of a family friend onto other photos of naked women. She was underage at the time. Then it gets much worse. I'm pretty sure what I found was CP, the size of the girl. She looked like she was under 10, had hands over her face, and various stages of penetrating her. I didn't know what to do. I was just a kid. I clicked it off and ran out of the room. It set off a trigger in me as he would regularly molest, abuse, and rape me. That started for me at the age of 8. I have since called him out on all of his disgusting behavior and cut ties with him. Unfortunately, I can't prove any of this. As far as I know, the computer that contained all of this is long gone. I should have said something the moment I found it, but as a child I was scared and thought I would get in trouble if I said anything and blamed myself for what I saw and for what I endured. 13. As a hardware tech working at a hospital, I got a high priority ticket to go into the OR. A computer shut down in the middle of performing open heart surgery on this guy. I normally don't cover this area, but it was early in the morning and I was the only tech on site. I go down there and I have to gown up to go into the room. I had no issue going until the nurse was like, "OMG, have you ever been in a surgery room before? The room is a bloodbath. This guy's is cut wide open. Are you going to be okay?" I was like, I was going to be fine before you started talking to me. Anyway, I go into the room, and it is a bloodbath with the guy's chest cut wide open, and a group of people operating on him with country music going while they were all singing. The issue was easy to fix. It was a desktop on a mobile cart that had limited mobility in that section of that room. Anyway, they had it pulled out as far as it could go, and the power cable came out of the desktop slightly. I just had to tighten up the connection and turn it on. It was one of the most shocking and amazing things I have seen. Just the guy's chest wide open and how calm and casually they are singing. 14. About 2 or 3 years ago, my fiancée and I were stood in the kitchen cooking dinner. I was stood by the counter talking to her whilst she was stood over the hob frying. She started slowly lowering herself closer and closer to the flaming hobs to the point I interjected and panicking said, "What are you doing?" For her to slowly turn her head towards me with the blankest of gazes and then proceeded to collapse onto the hobs. Thankfully, I managed to jump in and pull her away from receiving any burns, but she collapsed to the floor and was out for a good 30 seconds. I thought she was dead. I'll never forget that look in her eyes too. Really felt like it was over. 15. Battle of Fallujah in November 2004. I was a medic. Locked in the back of a Bradley fighting vehicle for 12 to 15 hours and was finally let out to stretch my legs and pee. Looked up and saw a guy running to the opposite riverbank. He sees us and turns to run. Then a shot rings out from a 25mm cannon, and a high explosive round hits him in the right butt cheek. He burst into a pink mist except for his left foot and shin, which wobbled back and forth before falling over, like a fucking cartoon. It was like I was standing next to him, but he was 275 to 300 yards away. I stood there with my dick in my hand and piss on my boot. I can still see it plain as day. 16. I used to work in a military hospital. Nowhere near any live action, but I did see everything from dead babies to amputations to CPR on a botched surgery patient who certainly wasn't going to make it. I could name a ton of things. But the one thing that stands out happened when I was just 6 years old. I was in kindergarten on recess. A boy grabs me and says he wants to show me something. He takes me to a small hidden spot on the playground and him and another boy start performing oral sex on each other, 5 or 6-year-old kids. I ran off and told the teacher. But now that I'm an adult, I realize that something was terribly wrong at home. We live in a fucked up world. Also, once we had to fly a morbidly obese woman to SeaWorld in a helicopter to weigh her on the whale scale. 17. Everybody thinks reporting is kind of an interesting profession, chiefly because journalists love to say self-congratulatory things about their work. In truth, it's kind of seedy, low-paying, and stressful with terrible hours and constant exposure to the worst things in society. This is why so many reporters become cynical burnouts with bad marriages and substance abuse issues. When I was a freshman and sophomore in college, I worked as a cub reporter for the morning paper. I was always being sent out to cover murders, shot house raids, and car wrecks. When I landed the gig straight out of high school, I thought, yay, I'm going to be a reporter. Hoo boy, I was the sheltered middle-class white kid from the suburbs, thinking he was going to see what life was really all about. The time I saw the aftermath of a wreck was the worst. According to the estimate of the police on the scene, the guy was doing 80 when he hit the end of the guardrail and plowed it up. Somehow the end of it went through his windshield and decapitated him, except for a single tendon, holding his head on. His eyes were open. I went behind the police car and threw up. Nightmares for weeks. Then there was the time when a photographer and I were coming back from an assignment, when some teenaged girl was raped in a bad part of town. She ID'd her assailant and the police found him in a seriously iffy neighborhood. We raced over there to get the story, only to find ourselves in 3 squad cars being surrounded by an angry mob. One guy decided to try his luck and snuck up on an officer with a lead pipe, who turned around just in time and laid the guy out. I knew it was getting bad when the police started pulling the street sweepers out of their trunks. This was the early 80s. I'm fully convinced that, had that police officer not turned around in time, the crowd would have gone nuts and I would have had my ass kicked. Or worse. But I finally quit reporting after another assignment. A kid from a wealthy suburb came home from college at Christmas, walked into the room where his dad kept the shotguns, and blew his head off. Because I was all of 19, the editor thought it would be a good idea if I talked to the father, because he might relate to me more. So here I'm 19, and having to ask the poor father if he knew why his son killed himself. I felt so freaking dirty doing it. I wrote the story, and the managing editor wanted to know why the hell I didn't learn why the kid offed himself. I asked him point blank, who really needs to know that information? I had a lot of guts for a kid. After that, I quit the job and worked for a bookstore. Paid less but felt better. Reporting was that damaging to my soul.